And welcome back to the Upside Sports Network. My name is Michael. Appreciate you guys joining us on a late Thursday evening. I know we told you guys we'd get back into some of the fantasy football stuff, and here we go. Went over the last couple of weeks anyway, going through a lot of the different projections that I saw out there, anywhere from ESPN, Yahoo, etc., NBC, Matthew Berry's rankings, pretty much everybody, and did a little bit of research on my own just to kind of see where everything ended up last year and what we're looking at this year. So we thought we'd break it down into a few videos here to begin at least. We'll start with quarterbacks today. We'll go into some wide receivers, running back rankings tomorrow, maybe some draft strategy as well. Finally get into tight ends, defense, and kickers, pretty much make all that into one video. And then we'll finally do some regular, good old-fashioned drafting with you guys here at the Upside. So make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. If you guys like the content, make sure to let us know. Hit that subscribe if you haven't already. But let's get started. Alrighty, so in case you guys are unfamiliar with the site I use for my fantasy football, I've been using ESPN for years and years and years. I'm kind of stuck in my ways, if you will. But I really like the way their format, it's very user-friendly, and it's very easy to get people that I know, friends, friend groups, etc., to join my leagues and be able to, create our leagues fairly simply. Now, I know there's a lot of other apps that may be better for some things, better for others, etc., but I'm going to stick with ESPN for me. But hey, if you like Yahoo better, go for it, or whatever site you guys use, go for it as well. But again, today we're going to start with kind of where quarterbacks should be in my mind. I know the consensus ranks, of course, have Patrick Mahomes up there at number 1. Then you look down here, you got Allen, Hurts, Jackson, and Burrow. Pretty much everybody has those guys around the top 5. If not, everybody has those exact same 5 guys for their top 5. But for me, I like a little bit of upside when I'm looking this high in the draft for a quarterback. We're talking about quarterbacks that you draft somewhere in the first 5 to 6 rounds. Now, in the past, you hear all these fantasy experts tell you, wait on quarterback, wait on quarterback. You can get somebody in the 10th or 11th round that'll give you solid production and won't kill you week to week. That may have been the case back then, but right now, this league is getting very, very thin as far as elite quarterbacks from a fantasy football perspective. You look at some of the quarterbacks here. Patrick Mahomes, you can pretty much count on him every single year. Even when he's hurt, he still puts up pretty darn good numbers. Josh Allen, that's a little bit more of a question mark, but because he's a running quarterback, he does give you a little bit more of a higher floor than anybody else, and he also has a little bit more of that boom or bust type of mentality at the top end of his ceiling anyway. You look at a guy like Jalen Hurts, he kind of gives you a little bit of everything. Very good runner, very good passer, high completion percentages at least last year. You look at Lamar Jackson anyway, all the weapons that he's now gained, and then you round things out with Joe Burrow, possibly the best quarterback in the entire league. But the question is he going to be healthy for the entire season? Will they try to run the ball more? They say they're going to continue to try to run the ball more in Cincinnati. I have yet to see, where that strategy really pays off for them week to week. But let's get into some of the rankings. Now, as I mentioned, these are kind of what everybody's consensus rankings are. For me, though, I like Justin Hurts as my number one quarterback this year. Why? Just look at the numbers he's been producing over the last couple of years. When he's the starting quarterback, the running game of the Philadelphia Eagles is literally the best in the entire league. Now, when you're talking about quarterbacks, usually you think, hey, that doesn't really matter. We're talking about fantasy football here. 10 yards gets you a point. You're talking about a touchdown gets you 6 if you're running the ball. Passing, you only get 1 point for every 25 yards you throw, and you only get 4 for every touchdown. So that's something to kind of keep your eyes open for as far as the league itself. Running quarterbacks do pose a little bit more value as long as they stay healthy. And that's kind of been the caveat with those running quarterbacks that we've seen in the past. If they get hurt, they can kill you in the second half of the season because you don't necessarily have somebody to take over for them when they are injured. Sure, you'd like to have their backup quarterback, but, are we really going to rely on a guy like Tyler Huntley for the Ravens if Lamar Jackson goes down? I don't think so. So I think if you're looking at the top-end quarterbacks, you need to make sure you get the best surefire option that you possibly can. For me, the guy with the best ceiling in the entire league this year is going to be Jalen Hurts. I think there's more in the tank for Jalen Hurts as far as running capabilities for him. I think the offense is going to be a little bit better with a better running game behind him as well. I know we talked about them being the number one rushing attack in the league last year, but when you look at who they now have in the backfield, Miles Sanders, credit to you. I understand you're a certain type of back, but DeAndre Swift is a different animal back there in the backfield. And I really like the pieces that they have now in that backfield to make them more of a thumping type of running attack. That will make Jalen Hurts that much more dynamic because it's going to force them to pay a little bit more attention with a heavier runner like Swift inside. Miles Sanders, as small as he is, that was kind of the bugaboo, at least for me. They didn't use him properly in Philadelphia. I think he's still going to be much better this year in Carolina, even when you consider the success that he found in Philadelphia over the last couple of years. But you look at that rushing attack, I think Jalen Hurts is going to have a very nice year. Now, as far as throwing options, you look at the outside. You got A.J. Brown, you got Devontae Smith, you've got Dallas Goedert now really kind of rising among the tight end ranks. We'll get into that in our tight end show. But for me, Jalen Hurts, my number one quarterback. Number two, I've got Patrick Mahomes. This was a little bit more of a toss-up than I make it sound here early in the video, but I really like just Jalen Hurts that much more. Speaking as a Cowboy fan, that should tell you just how high I think of Jalen Hurts as far as a fantasy quarterback. Now, whether I think he's going to win every single Sunday, that's a different question. But right now, he's the best fantasy quarterback out there. Patrick Mahomes might be the best quarterback, period, on the planet right now, outside of the retired now Tom Brady. But Patrick Mahomes, from a fantasy perspective, he gives it to you through the pocket. He gives it to you on the outside. He's not necessarily a running quarterback at all. He never really has been. Mobile, yes. Running, no. But his arm, that arm talent, the question is for him on the outside, do they have the weapons to be able to surround Patrick Mahomes with enough talent to be able to get it done? They're really going to rely on Mahomes' arm more than they ever have. The backfield's a little bit more of a question mark than it has been in the past. What are they ultimately going to shake out with that backfield as we get down towards week 10, 11, 12? Are we going to see the same starters back there? Or are we going to see a whole different group back there where they completely rely on Patrick Mahomes at that point? In which case his fantasy production might actually take off in the second half of the year. That's why I think the floor is so high for Patrick Mahomes, just because of the lack of a running game over the last couple of years that they could rely on. Travis Kelce, obviously the best tight end in the game. He is a round one type of tight end, something we have not really seen since Rob Gronkowski. And I think Travis Kelce's in for a really big year. But again, the question marks are on the outside. I wonder just how high the ceiling is for a Patrick Mahomes. That's why I put a guy like Jalen Hurts, who has a higher ceiling in my book than Patrick Mahomes. 3 for me, I got to go with Justin Fields. That's the biggest surprise, I think, in my top 5 for all you guys out there. I'm really buying into the Chicago Bears for the first time in years. You hear how the Chicago media always says, this is the year for Chicago. Everybody gets on to the Cowboys fans for that, but the Bears fans are just as bad at that kind of a thing. And they tell us year after year, the offense looks so much better. Well, this year they actually have weapons on the outside. You look at guys like Chase Claypool, etc. they brought in last year. Cole Kmet re-upped through an extension. You look at the DJ Moore acquisition, the trade that they made in the draft anyway, to be able to bring in a number 1 receiver for him. Now, there has been question marks about whether or not DJ Moore is a true number 1, but looking at what DJ Moore and how he complements this passing attack, I think he's exactly the type of receiver this team needs. Now, I still think they could use somebody with some real size on the outside. I think that would be the kind of the finishing touch for this team. They got a lot of guys with a lot of similar type of talents. DJ Moore is the best of those guys, and I think this offense is really going to take off this year. We talked about Philadelphia having the number 1 rushing attack. Bears were right there as well. They were fantastic last year. I think the backfield situation is a little bit different than last year as well. David Montgomery no longer in the house. I think Fields is going to throw the ball a little bit more and going to have a ton more success than he ever has in his entire career. So for my money, Justin Fields is kind of that high ceiling guy, but he does have a little bit lower of a floor than guys like Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, in my opinion. Now, running quarterbacks, as I mentioned, you got to worry about them getting hurt. I think they've really transformed this offense to work around Justin Fields a lot better than they ever have. And good on the Bears for finally getting some pieces to surround Justin Fields with, just to see what they actually have at quarterback and not just let him, be a one-man band back there. I mean, Justin Fields came into the league with such promise, and we'll see if they finally get some of that promise out of him. But for a fantasy football perspective, I just really like the ceiling on Justin Fields this year. I think we're talking about a 4,000 plus yard passer. I think we're talking about a running quarterback who runs for probably 800 yards, maybe 700 yards. We're talking about 6 to 8 touchdowns on the ground. I think he's in for a monster year. I think the more weapons that he has on the outside are actually going to open up some of those extra running lanes. I'm not necessarily a buyer in their offensive line being that improved. I want to see it first before I believe it. But for me, the weapons on the outside alone make Justin Fields that much better of a quarterback. I drafted him on his rookie year as kind of a lottery ticket, 16th round pick, just to have him on my bench. Obviously, did not work out that year, but he's really looked the part of a franchise quarterback this year. And I just really believe in the ceiling for Justin Fields. I think it's more likely than not that he actually reaches that ceiling than some of these other guys reaching theirs. So, number 4 on my board, I got Josh Allen, and it's all about the second half of the year for Josh Allen for me. Pretty much, the last year and a half, really. Josh Allen just hasn't been the same old Josh Allen. His numbers, at least passing the ball, are not great. The weapons they chose to surround him with last year were a big improvement. And it wasn't necessarily the biggest improvement from his fantasy perspective, at least. You look at Dalton Kincaid coming in. They already have Dawson Knox there. As good of a player as I think Dalton Kincaid is going to be, and an upgrade at that tight end spot, they already had a serviceable one there, and they weren't getting much production out of him. The rushing attack they say is going to be a little bit better. I'm not buying it. I think Josh Allen is still going to be the best running back that the Bills are going to have. They brought in Damian Harris from the Patriots. Again, I'm not buying the backfield of the Buffalo Bills. Now, I could be wrong. James Cook looked really good when he was coming out of college. I thought he would have a great year last year. I thought they would finally hand over the reins, and they just didn't. Whether it was that fumble in the first game of his pro career where it really took him out of the rotation early, they really need to hit the ground running as far as running the football with their running backs, and not just divert to, hey, well, we got Josh Allen. Why don't we just go back to Old Faithful, let him run for every 4 or 5 yard gain that we absolutely have to have, and just continue to just wear and tear on Josh Allen. Now, we saw Big Ben do that for years with the Pittsburgh Steelers, but you saw at the end how much of an effect it had on his longevity of his career. Now, you could say Ben Roethlisberger could have stayed in better shape and all those other kinds of things. I hear you. But you look at Josh Allen, big, strong kid. I'm not saying he can't take the punishment. but I'm just saying he can't continue to take that punishment and still have a long career. You're talking about quarterbacks who take this level of punishment. The maximum on their career as far as effectiveness usually is about 10 years. That's usually a great NFL quarterback, don't get me wrong. But I think his career would be much longer or much more extended if they stopped having him run for every 2-3 yard important down that they absolutely have to have. Turning around, handing the ball off to James Cook, while it's going to hurt his numbers from a rushing perspective, we've just seen his numbers from a passing perspective really nosedive as a result of him having to run the ball. So, from my perspective, looking at the Buffalo Bills from the outside looking in, their team alone would be better with him passing the ball more and handing it off more rather than him running it. But from a fantasy football perspective, I just don't see the Bills changing their ways. I think they're going to resort back to Old Faithful. You're looking at more mediocre Josh Allen performances offensively. You're looking at a quarterback who you expect to get those 25, 30-point games, and he's not going to get them. You're talking about a quarterback who's probably going to get you on average, 18 to 20 points a game, I think, by the middle of the season, and hopefully he's still healthy for you when you get down to the playoffs. So for me, he's still in the top quarterback tier, don't get me wrong, but I think there's real risk when it comes to Josh Allen as far as health and as far as performance on the field. Rounding out my top five, I have Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson's a great quarterback, great weapons around him. Running backs are still a mystery, which is why I think Lamar Jackson's still going to be a great running quarterback. The weapons he now has around him, the best he's ever had in his career. Contract situation is solved. You don't have to worry about him missing 5-6 games in the playoffs for your team in fantasy football championship time. And so Lamar Jackson, for me, is right up there in that top five group. In fact, for me, he probably has a little bit higher floor than a guy like Josh Allen. I just wonder how the receivers ultimately are going to mix in. They got a rookie, a guy who's missed over a year now with an injury, an OBJ. And this passing attack never has really gotten off the ground. Now, that's a new offensive coordinator there. I get it. I want to see it before I believe in the ceiling. The ceiling is very, very high. I'm just not believing that they can get there. The floor, I think, is a lot more of a surefire thing with Lamar Jackson, though, which is why he's in the top five ahead of guys like Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, and Trevor Lawrence. Now, 6, 7, and 8, those are Burrow, Herbert, and Lawrence. I think all three are great options. The health of Burrow is the question mark. Herbert, really like his production over the last couple of years. I think he's going to take a big step forward this year as far as a professional quarterback. I think they're going to involve Austin Eckler a little bit more than they did last year. I think Eckler was up and down as far as his usage anyway last year. I think Kellen Moore will be a lot more, how do I put this, a lot more cognizant of the fact that he has one of the best running backs in the league. And I think the Chargers are going to be a very good team. As far as from a fantasy perspective, I'd still rather have Burrow, even with the injury question marks, ahead of a guy like Justin Herbert. I just think Austin Eckler is going to be used a little bit more. I really like the receivers on the outside, kind of a three-headed monster there. Williams, Jefferson, and Allen. Really like all three of those guys. Williams is always kind of a boomer bust play every single week. He's on my do not draft board this year once again for that very reason. I never like boomer bust players from a week-to-week perspective. They say they're projected to get 10 to 12 points. You think, hey, it's a good bye week fill-in, or hey, he's really close. He's got a good matchup. But then the quarterback doesn't look his way the entire game, and Mike Williams seems to suffer from that type of a problem more than most other receivers out there. And especially with a new rookie coming in, a very similar type of receiver, I just wonder about how many targets he's actually going to get in that system. But speaking as far as Herbert specifically, again, just a tick below Joe Burrow for me. Burrow's my number 6. I have Herbert as my number 7. Trevor Lawrence, who I think has a real shot to win this year's MVP, is my number 8 quarterback this year. I just think the talent is there. I think the wide receiver group is significantly better now that they have a top dog in Calvin Ridley to take the pressure off a guy like Christian Kirk. I think both of those receivers are in for big years. I'm just curious how the running back situation is ultimately going to unfold. ETN, etc., health, all those kinds of things. But for a guy like Trevor Lawrence, I think the sky's the ceiling, if you will. I think he's got all the future in front of him from an offensive perspective as far as getting this team to win games. Now, is it going to turn into shootouts, etc.? Is their defense going to be able to stop anybody? They play in a very weak division, I'll put it that way. I believe in that defense, which, I mean, we're talking about a team that as long as they have a top 15 defense, they're not going to be in a whole lot of shootouts, and I don't think that's going to lend itself to a whole lot of fantasy points for Trevor Lawrence on a week-to-week basis. I think you're probably talking about a 20 to 22 point quarterback. on a week-to-week basis on kind of the higher end in my point, or in my opinion anyway. But he could be one of those 16 to 20 point a game type quarterbacks. Just kind of depends on how the game script, game flow goes. So for me, for that reason, that's why he is in the number 8 spot. Now, wild cards as far as quarterbacks that you may want to take later on if you miss out on all these top guys, or if you get one of these top guys and you're sitting there in the 14th round and you're like, hey, I'd really like to have a good backup and snake him off the waiver wire before anybody else can pick him up for their bye week fill-in. Those guys I'm talking about this year: Anthony Richardson of the Colts, Bryce Young for the Panthers, C.J. Stroud for the Texans, Kenny Pickett for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I'm going to even throw in a guy like Sam Howell for the Washington Commanders. Played well against the Cowboys last year. Kind of a bye week fill-in, though, for me. I'm not necessarily going to draft him in a league, but he has some under-the-radar things that you may want to keep an eye out for. Not saying you draft him, but you may want to stash him if he gets off to a hot start. The last guy on my kind of wild card list is going to be a guy like Deshaun Watson. He's probably going to be already drafted in your league, but if for some reason your league doesn't draft him and you're sitting there and Deshaun Watson's available in round 12, 13, 14, you really need to give him a hard look. I think everybody forgets just how good of a quarterback he was in Houston before all the issues that he had, the trade request, etc. But Deshaun Watson should be a much better quarterback this year. If he's not, the coaching staff will be fired. Everybody in that front office already has given a hard look because of the contract they decided to give him overall. But they need to figure things out in Cleveland with Deshaun Watson. So I think they ultimately will get a productive offense going. They gave up on Baker Mayfield in order to bring him in anyway. Not saying Baker's the answer for the Cleveland Browns, but they already had a quarterback that they drafted 1-1 and said, nah, we'd rather go for this guy, get rid of this guy, and literally pay another team to take him off our hands. That's how much they believed in Deshaun Watson. That's why I think this team is going to be significantly better, at least from an offense perspective, than they were last year. But again, if he's sitting there 12, 13, 14 round, go ahead and pick him up, throw him on the end of your bench, and just see what happens. If he gets off to a hot start, great. If they rely on Nick Chubb and just allow Deshaun Watson to make the right read, not throw the ball into double, triple coverage, etc., that may be the other option. If that's the offense that they choose to go with, then obviously just dump him. You got other options on the waiver wire out there. But for me, if he's available rounds 12, 13, 14, keep your eyes peeled for a guy like Deshaun Watson. Now, the rookie quarterbacks I want to touch on a little bit: Richardson, Young, and Stroud. All three of them are kind of wild cards. I think turnovers are going to be a big problem for Richardson in the early going. Stroud as well. I think Bryce Young's probably going to be the most the least loose with the football, we'll put it that way. So as far as like interceptions, low point performance weeks, I think a guy like Bryce Young is going to have a little bit higher of a floor this year. You look at C.J. Stroud, there may be maybe weeks this year where he puts up negative numbers from a quarterback perspective. Same thing for Anthony Richardson. I think he needs some time to mature, at least get some play calling, understand where the linemen are supposed to line up. He started 13 games in college. That's it. And we've seen how that's worked in the past. Those types of quarterbacks usually struggle at least for the first half of the season. So if you're going to draft him, make sure he's not going to be your week 1 starter in fantasy football. He needs to be on the bench, and if by the week 8, week 9, you start to see the running attack of the Indianapolis Colts look really good, Anthony Richardson's a good mobile quarterback, he's completing passes to Pittman, etc., then you may have an opportunity to start a guy like Anthony Richardson if he really has that great standout rookie of the year type performance. But I think he's kind of the biggest boom of the opportunity here. C.J. Stroud, I think, has the biggest bust opportunity here of my wild cards. C.J. Stroud's had some issues with turnovers so far the preseason, training camp, etc. And I'm just not buying the ceiling there yet for C.J. Stroud. They don't necessarily have great weapons on the outside. Mechie's going to be back. They got some other weapons there. Dalton Schultz is a tight end I think everybody should be keeping an eye on. He's going to be the safety blanket for Stroud this year. But as far as a fantasy football perspective, I don't think there's a consistent week-by-week performance that we see C.J. Stroud crack the top 20. So if by chance he stops turning over the ball and the team start to trust him a little bit better, the Houston Texans start to trust him a little bit more, then I think we could see C.J. Stroud really take off in the second half of the year. None of these rookie quarterbacks should be starting for you week 1 in fantasy football, short of there being an injury. Say you get Joe Burrow and you want to get Anthony Richardson as the backup to him, I guess. Then you put Anthony Richardson in there knowing Joe Burrow might be out that week, etc., I guess. But Anthony Richardson, as I mentioned, you should be starting him in the second half of the season if he's having a good season so far. Welcome back, Charles. Appreciate you for joining us. But that's kind of how my quarterbacks kind of stack up for me. You look at the 6 through 10 guys. We touched on a few of them there. Dak Prescott kind of falls in that range. Kirk Cousins, etc., falls in that range. Tua had a good year last year when he was healthy. He could have a great year with all the weapons they have there. He's another guy you might want to keep your eyes peeled for. The one quarterback that I mentioned as far as wild cards that I haven't really gone into depth to any length on is Kenny Pickett. Usually year 2, year 3, you start to see some real development or stagnation for a quarterback. Do I think Kenny Pickett has it in him to be a great NFL quarterback at this point? Possibly, but I need to see it before I actually start him in my lineup. I'm not necessarily drafting him. I'd probably keep him kind of at least on my watch list as far as players I might want to pick up after week 1 or 2 if he's off to a really hot start. He's in a tough division. You look at Baltimore, Cincinnati's in that division, Cleveland. It's a very tough division defensively. And so if he's not throwing the ball well, if Najee Harris can't run the ball and at least take some of the pressure off and at least open up some of the throwing lanes for him, Kenny Pickett could be in for a long year. But I think he has the ability to be a good quarterback, a very good quarterback. The question will be, does he really take that next step with his career? So we'll see what happens. That's kind of how my quarterbacks kind of shake out. So just kind of recap the rankings. We've got number 1, Jalen Hurts, 2, Patrick Mahomes, 3, Justin Fields, 4, Josh Allen, and 5, Lamar Jackson. Those are the guys I would be willing to draft in rounds probably 3 through 6, maybe even 2 through 6, depending on how your board really falls for you. We'll kind of do a draft strategy video here later on as well. But just looking at how things are shaking out as far as the drafting rooms are going, we're seeing quarterbacks being drafted a little bit earlier than we have in years past. So if you want one of these high-end quarterbacks and you don't want to settle for a mediocre quarterback like a Prescott or a Cousins, etc., you're going to have to draft him early. You're going to have to sacrifice one of your skill position players in order to do it. But it might be worth it for you in the long run because there are fewer top-end options than there ever have been. And the bottom of the pool isn't necessarily as good as it has been in the past either. So the haves and have-nots, kind of where the quarterbacks really are at right now. A lot of quarterbacks are really high on the food chain. And then you get into the lower-end quarterbacks, all the way down here, quarterbacks like Russell Wilson, Matthew Stafford, Kyler Murray, Jared Goff. If you're starting one of these guys, they should be as a bye-week fill-in only. If you're counting on them for anything more than that, I think you're kidding yourself. Russell Wilson, I'd put it this way. He's on my do-not-draft list. I want to see him produce with Sean Payton before I actually believe him, and I want to see it for a long period of time. I'm not talking 2-3 weeks. I want to see it for 6-7 weeks, and if by chance he's still on the waiver wire, I might pick him up. But even if he has a great 8 weeks and somebody else picks him up, I ain't losing sleep over him being selected by another team. So that's kind of how I see things working out. I know a lot of you guys are curious about Aaron Rodgers, formerly one of the top fantasy football quarterbacks. I think the addition of a guy like Dalvin Cook really should solidify his position in fantasy football this year. He's not a top 10 quarterback. He's barely a borderline top 15 quarterback. I think ESPN here has him ranked pretty fairly. About the 14th best quarterback. I would say he's behind Tua. I would say some of these other quarterbacks like Richardson have a chance to kind of leapfrog over Rodgers depending on how their rookie season goes. Daniel Jones, I'm not necessarily a huge believer in him. He was a very good quarterback as far as avoiding the big mistake last year, and so that's kind of why I think he's above Aaron Rodgers at this point. Aaron Rodgers, by the way, doesn't turn over the football either, and I have more faith in Aaron Rodgers in my book, so if I had to pick one quarterback to kind of go below Aaron, that'd be a guy like Daniel Jones. My one above by the second half would probably be a guy like Anthony Richardson. Stafford, if he gets back to the old Matthew Stafford and the Ravens start playing well, when we don't see Sean McVay, all the discussions about him retiring at the end of the season, going into broadcasting, etc., if he gets back into being that level of Matthew Stafford, then he could be another guy that leapfrogs Aaron Rodgers. I think Aaron Rodgers is a great NFL quarterback, really good as far as protecting the ball, not turning it over, but he's got a whole new offensive line in front of him. He's got a two-headed monster at running back, much like he did last year with Aaron Jones and Dillon back there. You look at the wideouts, they're good wide receivers, don't get me wrong. It's a very good skill position group. I think they could use one more big dynamic option on the outside. We saw all the rumors this offseason about a possible reunion with Devontae Adams. That would be a great piece for them. Garrett Wilson seems in line to be the Christian Watson for them this year. I know a lot of guys out there are really high on a guy like Garrett Wilson this year because of the production they got from Christian Watson last year from the Packers. I just don't see it. I think he's being way overdrafted. I think he's probably a top 20 receiver, don't get me wrong, but people are drafting him as their number one receiver, and that's a mistake in my book. So just looking at this quarterback group, that's kind of how the rest of it shakes out. So just to recap everything, I got Jalen Hurts as my number one quarterback this year, Mahomes 2, Justin Fields as my 3, Josh Allen 4, Lamar Jackson 5. If you guys want to check out our fantasy rankings tomorrow, we're going to do some wide receivers and running backs for you and go over some of the flex spots out there as well. But appreciate you guys joining us here tonight. Again, appreciate you guys joining us for such a late evening. We're going to start a little earlier tomorrow, but keep in mind we'll have some fantasy football drafts for you guys here as well in the next week or so. We'll get back into some baseball coverage as well here in the next day or so as well. I got another video coming out for you tomorrow touching on some of the fantasy football discussions we're going to have over the next week. So I appreciate you guys' support, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.